The twisted culmination of all my childhood fears was magnified tenfold when I heard the blood-curdling screams of my mother and sister end with gunfire. I instantly jumped out of bed knowing that I only had seconds before my stepfather Jed got to me. I realized my hurried escape from this madman was all in vain when once again I heard the gut-wrenching sound of gunfire. Child trauma is my story. The abuse and traumas I experienced as a child didn't come from just one incident or two. They came from many. From many sides for many years, age 2 through high school. And I did what a lot of abused and traumatized children do. I minimized it, blamed myself for it, and I seemed to work tirelessly on trying to get those that hurt and abused me to love and accept me. Now, fortunately for me, I was given a gift. I was given a voice. After a period of several years, it gave me the capability of leveraging myself out of my traumatic environments. And I have to say that if it wasn't for the occasional nurturing of a loving grandmother and a few teachers that believed in me and walked with me, one in particular, I honestly do not believe that I would be standing here before you today. I was the first person in my family to go to college. I studied vocal performance for several years, music. Now, I ended up with a degree in theology. Now, I say all that to say that from the outside, I appear to be a respected and successful adult. But on the inside, I lived day by day like a fearful, frightened child. And no matter what he did, no matter what he accomplished, never seemed to believe that he was enough. I struggled most days of my life in one way or another, and yet, strangely, I never seemed to be able to connect it to the abuse I suffered as a child. Now, I think it's important to mention that as a minister, I did everything that I was taught to do and everything that I taught others to do to be healed from my childhood. I participated in pastoral counseling off and on for years, worked through the forgiveness process with those that hurt me and abused me, spent endless hours in prayer and studying the scriptures to apply those principles that I believed were so important for me. I really did come to the place of believing that I was healed from my childhood. So what was I missing? I believe what I was missing was what Dr. Levine discovered about trauma, that it was encoded in my brain and in my body when I was a boy. Now, Dr. Levine discovered other things about trauma as well, like major characteristics of trauma. Some of them being the constant need for reassurance, helplessness, and even rage. Now, that rage could be turned outward, bringing harm to others, like what we've been seeing happening in our schools. Or it could be turned inward, producing self-destruction. I couldn't imagine physically hurting somebody else when I was younger, and I still can't imagine that today. But hurting myself, that came easy to me because I was brought up to believe that I deserved to be punished. And from that thinking, the self-destruction began. Eventually, in 2009, I had a breakdown that resulted in full-blown post-traumatic stress disorder. It was so severe that I had to be hospitalized. And during my time in the hospital, it was as though several of those compartments that had been kept under lock and key since I was a boy were suddenly reopened, as memory after memory of some of the traumas I experienced resurfaced. Even when I was released from the hospital, my mind was still so unstable. I remember having to set a timer to remind myself to eat. During that time, I started to see a psychiatrist. And that psychiatrist diagnosed me with chronic post-traumatic stress disorder. He also misdiagnosed me with bipolar disorder. misdiagnosed, put on medications, taken off those medications, put on others, taken off those, put on others. I went from bad to worse in a very short period of time. I'm now going to read to you a short excerpt from my autobiography, Thorns of Chester Street. Thank you. In a single night, the twisted culmination of all my childhood fears was magnified tenfold when I heard the blood-curdling screams of my mother and sister end with gunfire. I instantly jumped out of bed knowing that I only had seconds before my stepfather Jed got to me. The pounding of my heart was nearly as loud as the screams of my mother and sister. Should I hide, I wondered? No, Jed would find me for sure. I quickly took the only option I had. I flung the bedroom door open and ran. As I reached the top of the carpeted staircase and began to descend, I heard Jed's heavy steps on the creaking floor behind me. I missed a couple of stairs but caught myself on the wooden banister before I tumbled any farther. I realized my hurried escape from this madman was all in vain when once again I heard the gut-wrenching sound of gunfire. My lifeless body tumbled to the bottom of the stairs. Suddenly, my eyes flew open and I sat straight up in bed. "You're okay, Shawn," I said out loud, calming myself, as I had to do night after night from this hellish, recurring nightmare. It was only a few months after I started working with my new therapist that I shared with her this recurring nightmare that I just read to you, along with a few others that had tormented me throughout so much of my life. Each time I shared one of these nightmares with her, she would affirm me that I was now safe. One particular time after I shared one of these with her, she leaned forward in her chair and softly said, "Shawn, the monsters in your nightmares were not just the byproduct of a creative child's vivid imagination. The monsters in your nightmares were real. They were the adults in your life." As I sat there digesting her words, it was difficult to hear what I already knew to be true. And yet something deep inside me felt relieved. I had always struggled with accepting that the ones who were supposed to keep me safe were the ones that hurt me the most. And I guess I felt relieved because I felt heard and believed. It wasn't the first time that I talked about the abuse in my childhood, but it was the first time that I felt genuinely understood. During another session I had with my therapist, she informed me that my biological father and stepfather were sociopathic. Again, I struggled when I heard that. Now, during the trauma training workshop that we offer for educators and organizations working with children, I actually showed two different brain scans. One is of the brain of a healthy child, and the other is of the brain of a severely neglected child. And the changes in brain structure in these two different scans is absolutely undeniable. Researchers found that these changes are associated with emotional and cognitive problems. So this is what I started to learn as I was working with my therapist. I started to understand that there were things about myself, challenges that I lived with on a day-to-day basis that made life really hard, that were actually characteristics of trauma. And I had only associated these things with just being me, which only led to a belief system that I just wasn't enough. Like how my mind used to just blank out whenever I would become fearful or intimidated, sometimes not allowing me to see or hear what was happening in front of me for a period of time. Trauma. Why I couldn't seem to sleep at night. Trauma. Why I couldn't trust in relationships, always looking for the exit. trauma. Why I lived in such a state of panic and hypervigilance, never being able to just relax. The dots were starting to connect. My therapist said, Shawn, you have to understand that when a child is severely traumatized and left untreated, like you were, it's actually common for there to be episodes like that, and even others along the way. Do you know when she said that, it was like a light came on for me? Because I had had a few episodes over the years. Episodes that I was frightened of, confused about, didn't want anyone else to know about. One of these episodes happened while I was in 4th grade. Sitting in a chair, I would see my knees shaking. Trying to hold a pencil or a glass, I would see my hand shaking. When school finally got out for the summer, I found myself for several months living on the edge of panic. Every evening when the sun would start to go down, I would run and I would hide. And when my caregivers would try to come and find me to put me to bed, I would start yelling at them and screaming at them, begging them not to put me into the dark. And even though they would, I would lie there the entire night until I saw the sun shine through my window the next morning, because only then did I feel safe enough to fall asleep. Trauma. The time that I worked with my therapist was absolutely life-changing, to say the least. It was as though I was set on a road towards self-compassion. Because at that time in my life, I didn't basically have any. I was ruthless with myself. I think far too often, we who were abused as children end up taking the whip into our own hands, so to speak, and continue to beat and mistreat ourselves into adulthood, because that's all we think that we deserved. I know that I did. I worked with my therapist for 3 years, and when she finally retired, I started to work with another therapist. And for the sake of anonymity, I'll call her Iris. I hadn't been working with Iris for very long when one afternoon I showed up at her office completely stressed out, freaking out about a workshop that I had to facilitate the following week for a group of healthcare providers, and feeling completely unprepared. She calmly got up out of her chair, walked over to her desk, picked up a 4x5 card, walked back over, handed it to me, sat back down in her chair and said, Shawn, why don't you read that? I sat there in my chair firmly holding that card, and I began to read the Chinese proverb that was written on it. Tension is who you think you should be. Relaxation is who you are. I couldn't move for what felt like several minutes after reading that. It was only 2 sentences on that card, but it felt like pages of insight were being poured into me. Like the writer had written those words just for me. You see, tension, which often caused chronic pain in my body and drove me into panic mode over and over and over again, was all I could remember. I couldn't even imagine what my life would look like without it. And I never realized that before until that very moment that I was sitting there in Iris's office. From that time on, apart from cognitive behavioral therapy, Iris began to work with me on brain-regulating methods like mindfulness meditation, progressive muscle relaxation, and deep breathing. She had me listening to these guided relaxation downloads from Dartmouth College of Medicine. And it was while I was listening to these downloads that I started to learn how to apply some of these mind-body practices. She shared with me that there had been some studies done which indicated that when traumatized people engaged in these practices for long periods of time, they could actually begin to rewire their brains, so to speak. Do you know the hope that came back to me after hearing that. With my first therapist, I learned that I had so many of the signs which indicated that my brain had been wired differently because of trauma. But with my second therapist, Iris, I started to learn that there were some things that I could do about it. At that time in my life, I had come to the place of believing that trauma recovery was such an issue of life or death for me that I jumped in with both feet. I continued to work with Iris on a week-to-week basis, and I began engaging in these mind-body practices consistently for over a long period of time. So probably about 2 years down the road, I came to the place of not only feeling different in my own skin, but those around me who knew me well could see the changes that had happened in my life. A major measure of healing came into my life. And I also gained some valuable tools that I still find very helpful today. It was during that last year and a half while I was still working with Iris that I started to write my book, Thorns of Chester Street. Now, Chester Street was a street that I grew up on when I was a boy, and it represented pain and torture for me. Yes, it was difficult for me to write down some of those stories of my childhood, to string together some of those compartments that I had to keep separated in order to survive in my own head. But it was also incredibly healing. Healing in knowing that I was creating something that was giving that little blonde boy a voice that never had one. And healing in knowing that I was creating something that had the potential of helping many other people find their voice. During the last year of finishing up my book, I couldn't get away from some of the questions that were churning in my head. Shawn, how different could your life have been if you had found trauma recovery when you were 15 instead of in your early 40s? Is there something that you could do to begin helping children find this at a much earlier place in life so that they have their whole life ahead of them? And that's where the vision for starting the foundation came to me. Now, when it came time to putting a name on the foundation, I remember thinking, why not take the name Chester Street? That represented darkness and hopelessness for one little boy, and turn that into something that would represent hope, healing, and restoration for many children. And that's how the Chester Street Foundation was born.